In this presentation, you will learn about cultural studies. Cultural studies is an interdisciplinary field that is concerned with the role of social institutions in shaping culture. Cultural studies emerged in Britain in the late 1950s and subsequently spread internationally, especially to the United States and Australia. Originally, cultural studies were identified with the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies at the University of Birmingham, founded 1964 by scholars like Richard Hogarth, Stuart Hall, and Raymond Williams. Cultural studies later became a well-established field in many academic institutions. It has since then influenced sociology, anthropology, historiography, literary criticism, philosophy, and art criticism. The dominant areas are race, ethnicity, class, gender, and the production of cultural knowledge. In other words, it talks about culture studies from the perspective of an interdisciplinary subject. The creation of this discipline was not easy for the founders. Stuart Hall wrote letters to the University of Birmingham, to other departments like the Department of Sociology to collaborate and work in an interdisciplinary way. However, he did not receive any response. Interdisciplinary, what has been accepted today as normal, was difficult way back. The history of cultural studies can be seen with literary criticism. Raymond Williams and Richard Hogarth developed the Lewisite stress on literature. In other words, social evaluation, but later on they shifted their focus from literature to everyday life. Culture studies, in other words, talks about the politics behind the construction of culture. Who owns the power to create culture, how it is created, and the consumers ask such questions. Traditionally, the culture of rich was seen as high and studied and discussed. Culture studies observed the downtrodden masses culture and its complexity, and even questions the concepts of high and classical cultures. Culture studies founders were inspired by Italian Marxist scholar Gramsci, who spoke about the cultural domination of capitalist groups over marginalized groups. The dominant ideas of capitalists being sold to the lower and marginalized class. The process is so slow that one does not realize it. Similarly, many harmful products, which are the products created by capitalists, are being made habitual to the people who cannot afford them. It is the emotion that is being sold to the people. Baker notes that the subject of culture studies talks about taking for granted behavior, hegemony, culture construction, how certain things are accepted and why it operates, and how certain things are sidelined. Those powerful groups control the media and influence the decisions that affect the marginalized groups. There are some perspectives in cultural studies too, like phenomenology, cultural anthropology, structuralism, and critical theory. Cultural studies aims to comprehend how meaning is generated, distributed, and produced within a culture through varied activities, beliefs, institutions, and social structures. It demonstrates how certain objects in civilization or community gain meaning and value. Cultural studies are thus dedicated to studying a society's whole variety of arts, beliefs, institutions, and behaviors. According to Habib, much of what is labeled as cultural studies might easily be classified under numerous other titles such as Marxism, structuralism, new historicism, feminism, and post-colonialism. Cultural studies are concerned not only with the study of culture, but also with the formation of meaning through symbolic forms and signifying acts, as well as the impact of these practices on subjectivity. Characteristics of cultural studies. Cultural studies tries to understand cultural practices and their relation to power. Here the goal is to expose power relationships and show how these relationships influence and shape cultural practices. Cultural studies aim to understand culture holistically and analyze the social and political context within which it works. Culture in cultural studies always performs two functions: the object of study and the location of political criticism and action. Cultural studies tries to bring out complexity in the field of knowledge. It tries to evaluate modern society and its construction. Methods to practice cultural studies. Observe the code's science text, try to decode it, look how it is represented. Several key concepts are discussed in cultural studies like popular culture. According to Stuart Hall, popular culture is one of the sites where this struggle for and against a culture of the powerful is engaged. It is also the stake to be won or lost in that struggle. It is the arena of consent and resistance. For example, wearing jeans by the student movement in Europe was a resistance against the dominant practice of being in blazers and ties and neatly polished shoes. Culture industry. The term culture industry was given by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. They believed that mass media had negative effects on people. According to them, through advertisements and films, citizens forget their reality and thus become easily manipulated. Mass media had a primary role in exercising power by communicating determinate ideas, advertising products, and ignoring themes or issues. For example, aerated drinks are not healthy for the human body. However, it has been marketed in such a way that drinking it makes you look cool. There are also diet products available in a similar way. Folk culture or oral history. Folk culture is generally associated with peasant society. It is the culture connected to the roots of the population. For example, proverbs, riddles, poetry, oral history, folk songs. These songs are recited during village festivals. They involve stories of heroes, epics, mythological characters. Many a times these oral songs are recited and passed on from one generation to another. It is rarely recorded. Hence, these songs are marginalized in mainstream historical literature of textbooks and reference books. Globalization further marginalizes these songs through rapid mass media interventions and television. Culture and signifying practice. As Hall puts it, by culture, here he means the actual grounded terrain of practices, representations, languages, and customs of any specific society. Representation. Cultural studies are centered on representation questions like how the world is socially constructed and represented to and by us in meaningful ways. Feminism and Cultural Studies. In the Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies in Birmingham, in the 1970s and 80s, feminist cultural studies developed. It aimed at becoming a multidisciplinary, multicultural field. This area drew attention from different country scholars like Germany, France, US, Canada, Australia. There were also works from different political standpoints: women of color, Marxist feminists, women in exile, post-colonialists, lesbian studies, post-structuralism, psychoanalysis, sociology, medical science, etc. Different methodologies were also used to study feminism and cultural studies. Hegemony and cultural studies. To understand cultural studies better, we also need to learn about the concept of hegemony. The Cultural Studies Foundation School used this concept and was influenced by the creator of this concept too. Antonio Gramsci is the person who is involved with the creation of the concept. He was an Italian Marxist scholar. When he was jailed, he wrote about this concept in the book Prisoner's Notebook. Hegemony is the dominance of one group over another, often supported by legitimating norms and ideas. Hegemony is derived from the Greek term hegemonia, which means dominance over, and describes relations between city and states. Gramsci's discussion of hegemony followed his attempts to understand the survival of the capitalist state in the most advanced Western countries. A hegemonic class can attain the consent of other social forces, and the retention of this consent is an ongoing project. To secure this consent requires a group to understand its interests in relation to the mode of production, as well as motivation, aspiration, and interests of other groups. In other words, hegemony is control over individuals by a powerful group. This control is through a slow process that the opponent doesn't realize that they are being controlled or manipulated by the powerful. For example, in today's time, people spend on luxury. Achieving luxury is the dream of every individual. Class is being respected and valued by the majority, and achieving that is the goal of a large population. Capitalists are selling this idea to marginalized groups. This leads to the marginalized group often being discontented. Consumerist behavior is also a reflection of this. People buy many products online or in malls just because they are available for cheap. However, they may not have a utility. The smartphone is another example whereby people have been addicted to it. They cannot separate it as its utility value. Cultural studies and India. Cultural studies has been observed in India from different angles, layers, dimensions, and facets due to the diversity. Class, caste, digitalization, languages, technology, Bollywood film industry, reality shows, electric vehicles, and industries influence culture and hierarchy. In India, at times we have individuals who belong to the 18th century practices and the modern technological thoughts-driven person too within oneself. For example, the individual could have a university education yet follow unhealthy practices like dowry, child marriage, caste superiority, superstition, etc. So documenting and understanding cultural studies is a complex task. However, independent studies have been carried out by different anthropologists, sociologists, and literature students. Thank you for watching the presentation.